The United States National Intelligence Estimate for 1982, now declassified, declared that the wartime strategy of America's most formidable potential enemy at the time, the Soviet Union, would remain essentially unchanged over the next 15 to 20 years. Instead, just 7 years later, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. So despite 4 decades of bombastic talk from a series of Soviet leaders that the communist system would bury the West, it was the Soviet system, inefficient, abusive, tyrannical, that proved unsustainable. The Soviet Union broke into its constituent parts, and 15 different countries emerged from the implosion. Russia, of course, but also Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Uzbekistan, and 10 others. It also made the United States the world's only superpower. The U.S. Navy that existed at the time had been designed and built for the Cold War. Its missile-carrying boomer submarines provided a credible second strike capability to deter the Soviet Union from trying a preemptive attack. The Navy's surface fleet, and especially its large number of destroyers, was centrally focused on the anti-submarine mission because of the huge Soviet submarine fleet. Were either of those capabilities even relevant now? In short, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War required the U.S. Navy to reassess the role it was likely to play in what President George H.W. Bush called a new world order. Almost at once, the parameters of that new role were suggested by events that took place in the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. The United States was officially neutral, but it nevertheless assumed the responsibility of escorting the oil tankers of other neutral nations in and out of the war zone. The Navy was essentially the cop on the beat, maintaining order, protecting innocents, and, if necessary, distributing redemptive justice. It was a role that became more evident during 3 foreign wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which led to long-term overseas commitments. These wars demanded significant national investment in both lives and money, and they generated fierce debates about what responsibility, if any, the United States had to maintain peace in these far-flung corners of the world. In particular, Americans asked if the United States, as the world's only superpower, had a responsibility to monitor and chastise bad actors in the world. Well, if so, which ones? Was it any bad actor? And how bad must he be before the United States decides to become involved? And if intervention is justified, how much blood and treasure should the United States be willing to sacrifice to undo the bad actions of others? Even if you know the answer to that, how do you know in advance how much any particular war is going to cost in both lives and treasure? What if, after making a commitment, the cost turns out to be higher than expected? Do we then just leave? And finally, how long do United States forces need to remain in a troubled area to ensure local stability? Would Americans tolerate an occupation that lasted 5 years, or 10, or 20? All of these are important questions, of course, but note that they are strategic questions, questions for policymakers, not questions that can or should be answered by the Navy. The Navy's job in all these circumstances is to provide the best intelligence available, offer the best military advice it can, and then, once the decision is made, execute the national policy, whatever it may be. That makes the Navy's role in these 3 wars difficult to assess. Still, let's take a look at them. The first of them commenced on August 2nd, 1990, when more than 100,000 Iraqi soldiers, bolstered by 350 tanks, crossed the southern border of Iraq into the Emirate of Kuwait. The goal of Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, was nothing less than conquest. For one thing, it would give Iraq a much-needed seaport, Kuwait City, at the head of the Persian Gulf. It was not the first time Hussein had tried to obtain a bigger coastline. 10 years before, in 1980, he had directed his army into Iran, expecting an easy victory. Instead, that war turned into a meat grinder, the third bloodiest international war of the 20th century, with a death toll exceeded only by the two world wars. Iraq had to borrow heavily, including from Kuwait, to pay for it. So now in 1990, Hussein believed that conquering Kuwait would not only secure a valuable seaport at Kuwait City, it would cancel those debts and add to Iraq's own oil assets. There was no ambiguity in his attack. It was a straightforward, full-out military invasion, much like North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. President George H.W. Bush immediately labeled it naked aggression and vowed that it would not stand. To make good on that promise, Bush demonstrated both skill and patient diplomacy. First, he and his team assembled a huge international coalition that significantly included several Arab states. That was important lest the Arab nations in the region conclude that American intervention was simply a new form of Western imperialism. Then Bush orchestrated a massive buildup of military forces in Saudi Arabia, just south of Kuwait. Eventually, the Allies positioned some 700,000 troops there. After that, the Allies executed a swift and decisive campaign that drove the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. Finally, and this is critical, once the objective was secured, the war stopped. There was no attempt to go beyond the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border to occupy Iraq itself, as, for example, UN forces had sought to do in Korea, or to drive Saddam Hussein from power. Instead, it was a model of how to use military force to achieve a specific and limited objective. And while the war itself was mostly a ground operation, the Navy was a full partner in the air campaign and performed important logistic roles as well. Prior to the ground attack, coalition forces pounded the Iraqi army in Kuwait and its staging areas in Iraq with 38 days of intense bombardment. During the first 24 hours of the air war, the Navy launched 1,400 sophisticated Tomahawk cruise missiles, each carrying a 1,000-pound warhead, from locations in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. The Tomahawk's internal computers were preloaded with a digital terrain map of both the target and the route to it so that they could skim the terrain to the target, never flying high enough to be picked up on radar, and then strike the target with remarkable precision. On one occasion during the air war, a TV journalist was reporting live from Baghdad when an American cruise missile streaked past him en route to its pre-designated target. In addition to the Tomahawk missiles, the Navy also flew manned sorties from carriers. Dramatic improvements in ordnance and electronic guidance allowed the pilots to hit specific targets, again with remarkable precision. A detailed Air Tasking Order, ATO, was flown out to the carriers every morning. Instead of telling pilots to find and attack the enemy, the ATO specified that day's targets as well as the route to be flown. There were 4 U.S. Navy carriers in the Red Sea, the America, Saratoga, Theodore Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy. The planes on those carriers had to fly long distances across Saudi Arabia to get to their targets, and that meant that they had to be refueled in flight by Air Force tanker planes. Here was a classic example of jointness in practice. In spite of the long range, planes from carriers in the Red Sea sometimes executed 2 strikes a day. Carriers in the Persian Gulf, including the Ranger and the Midway, were closer to Iraq, and their planes often conducted 3 strikes a day. Combined with U.S. Air Force strikes by ground-based planes from Saudi Arabian airfields, coalition forces carried out a total of 94,000 sorties over a 38-day period, delivering 60,000 tons of ordnance. During those 38 days, the American public got powerful visual evidence of the new generation of so-called smart bombs. Tiny TV cameras in the missiles and bombs relayed images of the target outlined in crosshairs, getting closer and closer, and then exploding as the screen turned black. It was like riding the ordnance to the target. A Saturday Night Live skit satirized the precision of these weapons by showing a Saddam Hussein-type character in his office when an American missile knocked on the door. Of course, the weapons were not quite as accurate as the clips on the TV news suggested. The Pentagon released only the most dramatic footage. Still, the results were impressive. In the whole of the bombing campaign, the United States lost 41 planes and 43 Americans were killed, but they inflicted casualties estimated at 9,000 Iraqi soldiers killed and another 17,000 wounded. In addition, the unrelenting punishment from the air led 150,000 Iraqi soldiers to desert. Coalition forces were equally dominant on the ground. Iraqi combat losses are estimated to have been between 20,000 and 100,000 killed, while coalition forces lost 147, including 96 Americans. Some saw the decision not to pursue the retreating Iraqi army as a missed opportunity. These critics argued that the United States should have sustained the momentum, marched into Baghdad, and removed Saddam Hussein from power. Bush wouldn't do it. That had not been the initial objective and would amount to what the military calls mission creep. Bush had pledged to the Arab members of the coalition that the purpose of the war was to repel aggression, not to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Though some hawkish advisors to the president were disappointed, Bush called a halt to the war. As it happened, the hawks would have another chance. The second of the 3 wars in the post-Soviet era had its origins in the terrorist attack on the United States on September 11, 2001, when hijackers flew commercial airliners into the Pentagon in Washington and into both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. A 4th crashed in Pennsylvania when the passengers stormed the cockpit. Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed in the attacks, making 9/11 more costly in American lives than either Pearl Harbor or D-Day. 15 of the 19 hijackers involved were Saudi nationals. But the plot had been conceived and planned in Afghanistan by a group called Al-Qaeda, which is Arabic for the base. Al-Qaeda was able to hatch its plan in Afghanistan because the government there was under the control of an Islamic fundamentalist group, the Taliban, which tolerated its presence. President George W. Bush, the second President Bush, demanded that the Taliban turn the Al-Qaeda leaders and plotters over to the United States for trial. When that demand was refused, as expected, the United States orchestrated a campaign to overthrow the Taliban government and capture the plotters. Once again, the United States and its partners achieved a sweeping and overwhelming military victory. But this time, the aftermath was costly and frustrating. For more than a decade, the United States maintained a heavy military footprint in Afghanistan, fighting off Taliban guerrillas, even as the United States built roads, schools, and hospitals. The fighting dragged on for years, and the end was as chaotic as the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam had been a generation earlier. On August 15, 2021, after the American withdrawal, the Taliban returned to power. It was a sad anticlimax to a frustrating misadventure. The third war of this era, again against Iraq, was not in reaction to any specific act. Rather, it grew out of a suspicion that Saddam Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, or WMD in the common acronym, which, if true, would have been a violation of the peace treaty that ended the first Gulf War. It was not true. Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, but Saddam Hussein was coy about denying it because he wanted his enemies, both external and internal, to think that he did. It was foolish of him. And ultimately, it was also fatal. Once again, the military campaign called Operation Iraqi Freedom was fully successful. But as in Afghanistan, the subsequent occupation was marked by years of frustration and disillusionment. This demonstrated once again that military success, however one-sided, yielded few benefits if it was not accompanied by a clear war termination plan. Saddam Hussein was, by all accounts, a bad man, bad to his neighbors, both of whom he had invaded, and bad to his own people as well. But was that a justification for invasion and overthrow? Some cynics suggest that America's real goal was Iraq's oil, which may or may not have been a factor. In addition to that, however, pressure to act came from a group within the Bush administration known as neoconservatives or neocons. Strongly anti-communist, the neocons were also individuals who believed that the United States should assert its authority proactively, not only because the United States was the world's only superpower, but also because it was and should be the world's moral compass. So because Saddam Hussein was, by most objective measures, a bad man, he should be removed from power. In this war, the Navy's primary role was logistics. The Military Sealift Command brought the military personnel, the arms, equipment, ammunition, and most other elements of modern war to the theater. More than 90% of all the warfighting equipment for Iraqi freedom came by sea. In addition, Navy SEAL teams conducted both early reconnaissance and action missions. For instance, even as Iraqi forces retreating to Baghdad tried to sabotage some of the country's oil wells and refineries, Navy SEAL teams raced ahead to secure the oil fields before they could be sabotaged. Other SEAL teams were dispatched to find the vaunted weapons of mass destruction, though there were none to find. The quick victory in Operation Iraqi Freedom left a vacuum of authority in Baghdad, which experienced widespread looting. U.S. forces disbanded the Iraqi army, which in retrospect proved to be a bad idea, because it turned loose tens of thousands of armed men into the countryside with no central direction. Consequently, in spite of the swift military victory, the post-war period proved a long, ugly, costly, and unhappy slog. Taken collectively, these wars demonstrate that winning does not consist solely of defeating the enemy. The question in any war is to what end? What is the objective? Whatever it might be, it is necessary to have a clear war termination plan, in effect an exit strategy, in place. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, there was none. Warfighting was not the Navy's only job in the era from 1990 to 2020. It continued to perform dozens of quotidian responsibilities, some of which have always been Navy duties. Its humanitarian role of aiding ships and sailors at sea is an implied responsibility of all mariners, and given the U.S. Navy's global presence, it often fell to the Navy to act as first responders. As one example, on the day after Christmas in 2004, a massive earthquake off Sumatra triggered a series of enormous tidal waves called a tsunami. Some of the waves were more than 100 feet high, especially at a city called Banda Aceh. It was catastrophic. 250,000 people died, and more than 1 million were rendered homeless. Nations all over the world reacted with aid and support, but among the first to respond was the Navy hospital ship Mercy and the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. Though built for warfighting, the Abraham Lincoln is also well equipped to provide life-saving aid. Its distillers could produce 400,000 gallons of clean water a day, and helicopters from her flight deck worked around the clock to carry 6 million pounds of food and medical supplies and to bring out thousands of injured survivors for medical treatment. 6 years later, in 2010, another of the Navy's large nuclear-powered carriers, the Carl Vinson, fulfilled a similar mission when the city of Port-au-Prince in Haiti was leveled by an earthquake. Another Navy responsibility, ever since its founding, has been the suppression of piracy. Combating pirates in the Caribbean had been the Navy's primary mission in the 1820s. Nearly 200 years later, it again became a major function, particularly off the coast of Somalia near the Horn of Africa. Of course, 21st century pirates were a very different sort than those of the 1820s. Many used small outboard motorboats that were often towed out into the sea lanes by a diesel-powered mothership, then cast off to target huge container ships or tankers. Though the targeted ships were enormous, their crews were relatively small, so even though it might resemble gnats attacking elephants, the pirates were often successful. Pirates in motorboats would come alongside and fire or threaten to fire a rocket-propelled grenade into the ship unless they were allowed to come on board. Then they would hold the ship and its crew for ransom. It was a practice made famous by the movie Captain Phillips, in which Tom Hanks played the title role. To combat this menace, the U.S. Navy organized a multinational task force called Task Force 151, headquartered in Bahrain. Eventually, some 34 nations took part. The fight against the pirates became even more complicated in 2006, when Somalia was engulfed by civil war. Still, for the next several years, U.S. Coast Guard and Navy ships, plus British, Dutch, German, even Pakistani warships, patrolled the Horn of Africa to suppress and chastise would-be pirates. The Navy also worked to interdict the drug trade, much of it in the Gulf of Mexico and along the California coast. To do that, the Navy employed some of the protocols and weaponry that had been developed to combat Soviet submarines in the Cold War. Navy P-3 Orion aircraft would range well out to sea, looking for suspicious vessels, then vectored Navy and Coast Guard ships to intercept them. In other words, even absent wars abroad, there was, and is, plenty of work to keep the Navy busy. This era also witnessed the culmination of dramatic cultural changes in the service that had begun decades, even centuries before. The largely illiterate international crews that had manned the U.S. Navy ships in the age of sail, all of them men, who were kept in line by the carrot of a daily grog ration and the stick of the cat of nine tails, have been replaced by sailors who might be rated as electronics technician, information systems technician, or missile technician. It's hard to imagine what John Paul Jones would have thought of such a crew. African American sailors now make up roughly 20% of the Navy's enlisted force, and black officers constitute roughly the same percentage as blacks in the general population. 10% of the Navy's admirals are black. As for women, 18% of the Navy's enlisted force and 17% of its officers are female. Women were admitted to the Naval Academy for the first time in 1976, and while it took a few decades for them to be admitted into all career tracks, today they perform as weapons officers on ships at sea, as fighter pilots on carriers, and missile technicians on nuclear submarines. In 2014, an African-American woman, Michelle Howard, became the Navy's first four-star female full admiral and the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. One more barrier fell in 2011, when the awkward "don't ask, don't tell" rule concerning gay and lesbian sailors was eliminated. For 200 years, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, listed homosexuality as a crime, punishable by immediate dismissal and a less than honorable discharge. No more. Now, gay and lesbian sailors serve openly, and despite warnings that this would severely depress both morale and efficiency, neither turned out to be the case. In short, technologically, operationally, and even culturally, the United States Navy in the third decade of the 21st century is a very different thing than it was in the age of sail, in the age of the battleship, or even as it was only a few decades ago. It is smaller, at least as measured by the number of gray holes in the water, but it is remarkably capable, and it remains the most powerful sea force in the world.